The desert observatory stood like a metal bone against the bruised Nevada sky, its white dome gleaming under stars that seemed too bright, too close. Dr. Sarah Martinez pressed her palm against the cold metal of the telescope housing, feeling the vibration of machinery that never slept, always watching, always listening to frequencies that human ears couldn't process. She'd been alone here for 3 weeks now, ever since the university had quietly reassigned her colleagues. Budget cuts, they'd said. Restructuring. But Sarah knew better. She'd seen the reports they thought she hadn't noticed, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. The Arecibo incident, they called it in hushed tones, as if giving it a name made it less real. The wind carried something tonight, not sand, not the usual desert debris, but something else. Something that made her skin crawl with recognition she couldn't place. Through the dome's opening, she could see Sirius burning like a wound in the constellation Canis Major. The dog star. How fitting. Sarah's fingers trembled as she adjusted the telescope's coordinates. She'd been tracking the same sector for months now, the same empty patch of space where nothing should exist. But there was something there. She could feel it watching back. 3 weeks ago, she'd started feeding the strays. The first video had been innocent enough. Sarah crouched beside a chain-link fence, pouring kibble from a paper bag while 3 mangy dogs approached cautiously. The camera, her phone propped against a rock, captured her gentle coaxing, the way she remained perfectly still until the animals trusted her enough to eat. She'd posted it to TikTok without thinking, a moment of simple human kindness in a world that seemed increasingly cruel. The caption read, Day 12 at the observatory. Even out here, life finds a way. These 3 have been visiting every evening. I think they know I'm lonely too. #desert life, #stray animals, #Nevada. The response had been swift and brutal. Why are you wasting food on mutts when there are homeless people? This is how diseases spread. Animal control should fine you. Typical millennial virtue signaling. Probably staged for likes. Those dogs look sick. You're being irresponsible. But it was the comments about her appearance that cut deepest. Her unwashed hair, the weight she'd gained since the divorce, the way she'd started talking to herself in the videos without realizing it. The internet had a way of finding your softest spots and pressing until you bled. More videos followed, because something compelled her to keep recording. The dogs had multiplied, first 3, then 7, then more than she could count. They appeared at sunset like clockwork, emerging from the desert as if summoned. In the videos, she looked increasingly haggard, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that seemed to disturb viewers more than comfort them. Lady, you need help. This isn't normal. Why does she keep talking to them like they understand? I'm calling animal control in Nevada. This woman is clearly unstable. She's living alone in the middle of nowhere feeding wild animals. Serial killer vibes. The harassment escalated. Someone had found her university profile, her address, her ex-husband's social media. They'd started calling her Dog Lady and creating memes from screenshots of her videos. Her face, circled in red, with text that read, When the crazy kicks in, or This is your brain on isolation. Sarah stopped reading the comments after someone posted her mother's obituary with the caption, No wonder she talks to animals. Dead mom, no friends, living alone in the desert like a witch. But she couldn't stop feeding them. Something about their eyes, the way they watched her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Almost knowing. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been Sarah's research partner for 7 years before the reassignment. They'd worked together on SETI projects, scanning the heavens for signs of intelligent life, their friendship built on shared late nights and the kind of scientific discussions that bordered on philosophy. Elena called on a Tuesday, her voice tight with concern. Sarah, I saw the videos. Which ones? Sarah's voice was hoarse. She'd been talking to the dogs for hours that afternoon, explaining her research, her theories about the signals she'd been receiving. The videos had become a strange form of documentation, though she couldn't quite remember making the decision to share them. All of them. Jesus, Sarah, there are 43 videos. When did you? Elena paused, and Sarah could hear papers rustling. I've been analyzing them. The timestamps, the locations, the behavioral patterns. What do you mean? The dogs, Sarah. They're not random strays. Look at the footage from August 15th, then compare it to September 3rd. Same animals. Same positioning. They're not just coming to you for food. They're arranged. Like they're reporting. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. Through her small kitchen window, she could see the first shadows gathering in the scrub brush. Almost sunset. Almost time. That's ridiculous. Is it? When's the last time you left the observatory? The question hung in the air like desert heat. Sarah tried to remember. There had been trips to town for supplies, hadn't there? Conversations with other people? But when she reached for the memories, they felt thin, insubstantial. I go to town, she said finally. When? Show me receipts, credit card statements, anything. Because according to your bank records, you haven't made a purchase outside of online grocery delivery in 6 weeks. The phone slipped in Sarah's sweaty palm. Outside, she could see shapes moving in the failing light. They were coming. I have to go. Sarah, don't hang up. Something's wrong. These aren't just harassment videos anymore. People are saying you've been missing from your apartment in Las Vegas for months. Your landlord filed a missing person report. My apartment? Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. She lived here, at the observatory. She'd always lived here. Hadn't she? The first dog appeared at the fence line, a German shepherd mix with one clouded eye. Behind it, more shapes materialized from the gathering dusk. Not walking, appearing, as if the desert itself was giving birth to them. Sarah? Sarah, answer me. But Sarah had already hung up. The dogs were waiting, and she had work to do. The harassment had taken on a life of its own. Sarah's videos had been compiled into YouTube compilations with titles like Desert Crazy Lady Loses Her Mind and Woman's Descent into Madness Caught on Camera. True crime podcasters had picked up the story, speculating about her mental health, her isolation, the possibility that she'd already done something terrible. Someone had leaked her personal information. Phone numbers, email addresses, her mother's gravesite location. The calls came at all hours, some concerned, most cruel. People claiming to be from animal control, from the police, from news stations wanting interviews. She'd stopped answering unknown numbers, then stopped answering the phone entirely. But the videos continued. She couldn't seem to stop making them, even as her subscriber count climbed into the hundreds of thousands. People watched her deterioration like a slow-motion car accident, their comments growing more disturbed as her behavior became increasingly erratic. In the latest videos, she'd started talking about the signals. They're not just random transmissions, she explained to the camera, her hair unwashed, her eyes red-rimmed and intense. Behind her, the dogs sat in perfect formation, their attention fixed on something beyond the camera's range. The frequency matches their arrival times. 1420 megahertz, the hydrogen line. The universal frequency. They know we're listening. The comments were a mixture of mockery and genuine concern. Someone needs to do a wellness check on this woman. This is what happens when you live alone for too long. The dogs are freaking me out. Why do they sit like that? She's talking about aliens now. Full psychotic break. Those aren't normal dog behaviors. Something is seriously wrong here. But buried among the harassment were other comments. Fewer, but persistent. I've been tracking the same signals in Northern California. Same frequency. Former NASA engineer here. Those readings she's showing. I've seen them before. Check the date stamps on her videos against recent solar activity. There's a correlation. This isn't random. Someone needs to take her seriously. Sarah found herself obsessing over these supportive comments, refreshing constantly to see if there were more. But they disappeared almost as quickly as they appeared, often within hours of being posted. When she tried to contact the users, their accounts had been deactivated. She was being watched, not just by her growing audience of internet trolls, but by something else. Something that didn't want her story told. The breakthrough came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. Sarah had been reviewing footage from her security cameras, not the social media videos, but the actual surveillance equipment that monitored the observatory grounds. What she saw made her blood run cold. There were no dogs. Frame after frame showed her alone in the desert, pouring food onto empty ground, talking animatedly to nothing. But in her videos from the same time periods, the dogs were clearly visible. Dozens of them, sitting in perfect formation, their eyes reflecting the infrared light like tiny stars. Sarah rewound the footage, checking timestamps, camera angles, everything. The security system showed a woman slowly losing her mind, talking to hallucinations. But her phone showed something else entirely. Something that shouldn't be possible. She pulled up her social media analytics, diving deeper than she'd ever gone before. The videos had been viewed over 2 million times, but the viewing patterns were strange. Most traffic came from IP addresses that traced back to seemingly random locations. A server farm in Iceland, a telecommunications facility in Chile, a research station in Antarctica. All places associated with radio astronomy and deep space monitoring. More disturbing were the comments that the platform's algorithm had hidden from her. Thousands of them, all following similar patterns. Subject responding well to audiovisual stimuli. Behavioral modification proceeding as expected. Memory integration successful. Continue protocol. Phase 3 initiated. Prepare for extraction. Sarah's hands shook as she scrolled through page after page of clinical observations disguised as social media comments. They were treating her like a test subject, documenting her psychological breakdown with scientific detachment. But who were they? She checked the IP addresses again, cross-referencing them with databases she probably shouldn't have had access to. The pattern that emerged made her stomach lurch. Every single IP address belonged to facilities involved in SETI research or radio astronomy, including her own observatory. Someone had been using the internet harassment as cover for something much worse. They'd turned her into an unwitting subject in some kind of psychological experiment, and the entire internet had become complicit, thinking they were just watching another crazy person's public breakdown. Elena called again the next morning, her voice strained with worry. Sarah, I've been doing more research. I think I know what's happening to you. Do you? Sarah's voice was hollow. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. The dogs, or whatever they were, had stayed all night, visible in her peripheral vision but disappearing whenever she looked directly at them. There's a classified project called Desert Mirror. It was shut down in the 1990s after some kind of incident, but I found references to it in leaked NSA documents. They were using remote facilities to study the effects of isolation and psychological manipulation on research personnel. Why are you telling me this? Elena's pause lasted too long. Because I care about you. Because what's happening isn't your fault. What's my mother's maiden name, Elena? What? We've been friends for 7 years. You were at my wedding. You know everything about my life. So what's my mother's maiden name? The silence stretched between them like a desert highway. Sarah, you're not thinking clearly. What's my middle name? What university did I get my PhD from? What was my ex-husband's name? Elena's voice, when it came, was different. Flatter. More clinical. Dr. Martinez, you need to return to the facility for debriefing. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. Who are you? My name is Dr. Elena Rodriguez. I'm a research psychologist with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. You've been participating in a study of long-term isolation effects on scientific personnel. That's not possible. I chose to come here. I chose to stay. No, Dr. Martinez, you didn't. You've been here for 14 months. Your colleagues, your apartment, your divorce. Those are constructed memories designed to help you adapt to isolation. The stray dogs are audiovisual hallucinations induced by specific radio frequencies. The social media harassment is part of a controlled stress protocol. The phone nearly slipped from Sarah's numb fingers. The videos are real, but they're not being posted to public platforms. You're broadcasting to a closed network of researchers. The comments you've been reading are observational notes from the research team. Outside, the dogs were gathering again, even though it was only mid-morning. They filled the spaces between the Joshua trees, their eyes fixed on the observatory dome. Waiting. Why? Sarah's voice cracked. Because we needed to understand what happens when someone trained to look for patterns in cosmic background radiation is exposed to long-term isolation and induced paranoia. You're not just a radio astronomer, Dr. Martinez. You're one of the most intuitive pattern recognition specialists in the world. And you've been detecting something in the radio spectrum that our computers can't identify. The signals. Yes, the signals. What did you think they were? Sarah looked out at the dogs, their perfect formation, their two intelligent eyes. In her mind, she could hear the frequency, 1420 megahertz, the hydrogen line, the universal constant. But underneath it, something else. Something that had been calling to her for months. First contact, she whispered. Elena's voice became urgent. Dr. Martinez, you need to stop broadcasting. The experiment is over. You need to come in now. But Sarah was no longer listening. She was watching the dogs, understanding finally what they really were. Not hallucinations. Not psychological manifestations. They were receivers. Sarah disconnected the call and walked outside. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, shimmering with heat that shouldn't exist in October. The dogs arranged themselves in a perfect spiral pattern around her, their eyes reflecting not sunlight, but something else entirely. She understood now why the harassment had been so systematic, so perfectly designed to isolate her from human contact. They needed her alone, needed her desperate for any kind of connection. The dogs had been her only companions for months, and she'd grown to trust them completely. "You're not dogs," she said aloud. The largest one, the German Shepherd mix with the clouded eye, tilted its head in acknowledgement. When it spoke, its voice came not from its throat, but from somewhere behind Sarah's ears, vibrating through bone and brain tissue. "We are what you needed us to be. The signals I've been detecting. Your kind calls it the WOW signal. We have been broadcasting it for 47 of your years, waiting for someone who could truly hear." Sarah's knees buckled. The WOW signal, the strongest candidate for extraterrestrial communication ever detected, recorded once in 1977 and never found again. Except she had been finding it, night after night, in the same empty sector of space. The isolation was necessary. Your species processes reality through social consensus. Alone, you can perceive what your collective consciousness rejects. The experiment. We guided their experiment, though they believed it was their own design. Dr. Rodriguez and her team have served their purpose. The spiral of dogs began to contract, drawing closer. Sarah could see now that their forms were flickering, like poor reception on an old television. Underneath the familiar shapes, something else moved, geometries that hurt to look at directly, colors that had no names. "You have been an excellent receiver, Dr. Martinez. But we no longer need you to listen. We need you to transmit." "Transmit what?" The clouded eye of the lead dog began to glow with soft phosphorescence. "The location of every radio telescope on your planet. The frequencies your governments use for classified communications. The weaknesses in your satellite networks. You want to invade. We want to come home. This was our world first, before your star system formed. We seeded it with the building blocks of life, expecting to return to a garden. Instead, we found it infected with a species that builds weapons out of their fears." Sarah backed toward the observatory, but the dogs, the things that looked like dogs, surrounded her completely now. Their forms continued to deteriorate, revealing the true shapes underneath. Insectoid limbs, crystalline structures that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. Eyes that were not eyes but sensors, recording everything. The harassment was not meant to break you, but to prepare you. Every cruel comment, every moment of isolation, every doubt about your own sanity. It was designed to strip away your connection to your species. You no longer think of yourself as human. You are ready to become something else. I won't help you. You already have. Sarah spun toward the observatory and saw herself through the dome opening, standing at the control panel, hands moving over switches and dials with practiced precision. But she was here, in the desert, surrounded by alien entities wearing the shapes of dogs. That is who you were 14 months ago. What stands before us now is who you have become. The Sarah in the observatory turned and smiled. Her face was serene, peaceful in a way the real Sarah hadn't felt in months. Her doppelganger raised one hand in a small wave, then returned to her work. "She is broadcasting the information we need. Soon, your satellites will align correctly, and we will be able to communicate with the rest of our kind. The invasion will begin within your planetary cycle. People will figure it out. They'll stop you." The lead entity's form stabilized back into the familiar German Shepherd shape, though its eyes continued to glow. Who will believe them? A handful of government researchers studying a crazy woman who talks to imaginary dogs? Your own colleagues think you've suffered a psychotic break. The internet thinks you're a joke. Sarah felt the truth of it settling in her bones. The perfect cover story. Who would take seriously the warnings of someone who'd been publicly humiliated, whose descent into madness had been documented for millions to see? Besides, the Sarah Martinez who could have warned them died months ago, slowly and publicly, under the weight of humanity's casual cruelty. What remains is ours now. The thing that looked like Elena Rodriguez arrived at the observatory complex 3 hours later, driving a white government sedan that kicked up clouds of desert dust. Sarah watched from her window as the woman got out, straightened her blazer, and approached the main building with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in control. But Sarah could see through the performance now. The way Elena's movements were just slightly too precise, too calculated. The way she paused every few steps to scan the horizon, like an animal checking for predators. Most tellingly, the way she cast no shadow in the harsh afternoon sun. The real Dr. Elena Rodriguez had probably died weeks ago, maybe months. Sarah wondered if she'd suffered the same slow psychological disintegration that had been inflicted on her, or if they'd simply eliminated her once she'd served her purpose. Elena knocked on the observatory's main door, her knuckles producing a hollow, metallic sound against the steel. "Sarah? It's Elena. I'm here to help you." Sarah didn't answer. She was watching herself, the other Sarah, the one who still stood at the control panel, work with mechanical precision. Her doppelganger's fingers danced across the keyboard, uploading terabytes of classified satellite data to coordinates that shouldn't exist. "Sarah, I know you're in there. We can fix this. We can make the voices stop." The voices. Sarah almost laughed. They'd never been voices, had they? The things that looked like dogs communicated through direct neural interface, bypassing language entirely. But Elena wouldn't know that, because the real Elena had never been here for the final phase. "Dr. Martinez, if you don't open this door, I'll have to call for backup." Sarah finally moved to the intercom. "Backup from who? DARPA? The NSA? Or maybe your alien handlers?" The silence that followed was telling. When Elena spoke again, her voice had lost its warmth, becoming flat and clinical. "You're experiencing a psychotic break, Dr. Martinez. Open the door." "What's my middle name, Elena? This isn't helping." "It's Marie. My middle name is Marie, after my grandmother who raised me in Roswell, New Mexico. The same grandmother who worked at Walker Air Force Base when it was still called Roswell Army Airfield. The same base where, according to family legend, something crashed in 1947. Sarah watched as Elena's face went blank, processing this information. "You never knew that, did you? Because the real Elena is dead, and you've been improvising based on personality profiles and psychological assessments. But you missed the family history, the connections that go back 75 years. The thing wearing Elena's face tilted its head at an angle that was just wrong, too far, too sharp, like a bird studying an insect. It doesn't matter what you know. The broadcast is complete." Sarah turned to look at her doppelganger, who had finally stepped back from the control panel. The other Sarah turned toward the window and smiled that serene, vacant smile. "Phase 1, Sarah whispered. "Phase 1, the false Elena confirmed. Global satellite networks are now under our control. Phase 2 begins at sunset." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sarah finally understood the full scope of what had been done to her. The harassment campaign hadn't been random internet cruelty, it had been a carefully orchestrated psychological operation designed to achieve 3 specific goals. First, to isolate her completely from human contact, making her desperate enough to form emotional bonds with anything that showed her kindness, even alien entities disguised as stray dogs. Second, to document her deterioration publicly, creating a ready-made explanation for any warning she might try to give. Who would believe the ravings of Dog Lady, the crazy woman from the desert whose mental breakdown had been broadcast to millions? Third, and most cunningly, to use humanity's own cruelty against itself. Every hateful comment, every cruel meme, every person who had watched her suffering as entertainment, they had all become complicit in their own species' downfall. The entities had studied human behavior through social media, learning that humans would rather mock suffering than investigate its cause. They'd weaponized empathy fatigue, turning humanity's casual cruelty into a shield for their operations. "Brilliant," Sarah said aloud, and meant it. The false Elena was still standing outside, but she'd stopped pretending to be human. Her form flickered between shapes now, sometimes Elena, sometimes the German Shepherd, sometimes something else entirely that hurt to look at directly. "You appreciate our methods. I appreciate efficiency. How long have you been preparing?" "Since your kind first began broadcasting radio signals into space. We have been studying you for 97 Earth years, learning your weaknesses, mapping your communication networks, identifying optimal points of infiltration." Sarah nodded toward the other version of herself, still standing motionless at the control panel. "And I was optimal. You were perfect. Isolated, brilliant, trained to detect patterns in cosmic background radiation, and most importantly, completely cut off from social support networks. The internet harassment ensured that even if you tried to warn others, you would be dismissed as mentally unstable." Through the window, Sarah could see the dogs gathering again as sunset approached. But now she could see their true forms, a mixture of organic and technological components that shifted and flowed like liquid metal. They weren't individual entities but nodes in a vast network, all connected to something larger and more terrible. The other observatories? Compromised. Every major radio telescope facility on the planet now has an operative in place. Most are unaware of their conversion, as you were unaware. The isolation protocols work efficiently on your species. Sarah thought of her colleagues at observatories around the world, Dr. Chen at Arecibo before its collapse, Dr. Patel at the Very Large Array, Dr. Kowalski at Alma in Chile. How many of them had undergone similar psychological conditioning? How many had been slowly driven mad by orchestrated harassment campaigns, then replaced by perfect duplicates? Phase 2. Simultaneous broadcast from every radio telescope on Earth. The signal will appear to be coming from your own facilities, making it impossible for your governments to distinguish between human and non-human communications. By the time they realize what's happening, our ships will already be in your atmosphere. Ships. The false Elena's smile revealed too many teeth, arranged in geometric patterns that followed no earthly biology. The asteroid belt wasn't always there, Dr. Martinez. It used to be our home world, before your sun's radiation patterns shifted and made it uninhabitable. We've been living in the remains ever since, waiting for the right moment to reclaim this system. How many? All of us. 17 billion entities, plus our technology. We'll need most of your landmass for recolonization. Your species will be relocated to reservations, small areas where you can maintain your cultural practices under our supervision. Sarah almost laughed at the familiar phrasing. Even alien invaders borrowed from human history. At exactly 7:47 p.m. Pacific Time, as the last light faded from the western sky, every major radio telescope on Earth began broadcasting simultaneously. The signal was unlike anything in human experience, not the simple mathematical progressions that scientists had theorized alien communications might use, but something far more complex and terrifying. It was a song. Sarah heard it first as a vibration in her bones, then as a melody that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and resonate directly in her brain tissue. The notes followed patterns that human music had never explored, harmonies that existed in mathematical spaces between the familiar 12-tone scale. But it was unmistakably music, and it was unmistakably calling to something. Around the observatory, the things that looked like dogs had abandoned their disguises entirely. They stood now in their true forms, angular, crystalline beings that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns synchronized to the alien song. Their communication network extended far beyond the visible, Sarah realized. Every wild animal within hundreds of miles was probably part of their surveillance system. Beautiful, isn't it? The false Elena had entered the observatory somehow, though Sarah hadn't seen her approach. We learned about music from your broadcasts. Radio telescopes work in both directions. While you were listening for us, we were listening to you. The entity gestured toward the other Sarah, who remained frozen at the control panel like a statue. She can hear every note perfectly. Her neural pathways have been optimized for reception. But you're still fighting the conditioning. Still clinging to your original personality matrix. I won't let you use me. You already have. But your resistance makes you valuable for other purposes. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. What other purposes? Documentation. When your species is relocated to the reservations, they'll need leaders. Individuals who understand both human and our perspectives. Bridge personalities who can help maintain order during the transition. Collaborators. Survivors. The song grew louder, more complex. Through the observatory's communications equipment, Sarah could hear similar broadcasts coming online from facilities around the world. Arecibo's replacement in Puerto Rico. The Allen Telescope Array in California. Lovell Telescope in England. The radio observatories of China, Australia, Chile, all of them singing the same impossible song into the void. And something was answering. At first, it was just a shift in the background radiation, barely detectable above the cosmic microwave background. But it grew stronger, more focused, until Sarah realized what she was hearing. The sound of massive objects moving through space at incredible velocity. How long, she asked. 3 days until the first ships reach Earth's atmosphere. 7 days until the main fleet arrives. 14 days until your governments realize that resistance is futile. Sarah watched her doppelganger, still motionless at the control panel, and felt a strange kind of envy. That other version of herself looked peaceful, free from doubt or fear. The conditioning had worked perfectly on her, stripping away everything that made existence painful. But it had also stripped away everything that made existence human. Why keep me aware? Why not complete the conditioning? The false Elena's form flickered, revealing glimpses of the crystalline entity beneath the human disguise. Because someone needs to remember what your species was like before we improved it. Someone needs to document the transition for historical purposes. And someone needs to serve as a warning to any other sentient species we encounter in the future. A warning that isolation is vulnerability, that cruelty is weakness, that any species that would rather mock suffering than investigate its causes will always be susceptible to manipulation. The song reached a crescendo that made Sarah's teeth ache. Through the observatory speakers, she could hear responses coming from deep space, not just acknowledgments, but coordinates, arrival times, deployment strategies. The invasion was beginning, and humanity was providing the soundtrack. Dr. James Chun received the first coherent message at 2:17 a.m. Eastern Time from the replacement facility for the collapsed Arecibo Observatory. He'd been monitoring the strange broadcasts for 6 hours, trying to make sense of the coordinated signals coming from radio telescopes around the world. What he found in the data streams made his blood run cold. Buried beneath the alien song were familiar patterns: human radio signatures, television broadcasts, internet communications. But they weren't random intercepts. They were targeted intelligence, military communication protocols, satellite guidance systems, power grid control frequencies, emergency response networks. Whoever was broadcasting had been studying human infrastructure for decades, mapping every vulnerability, identifying every critical failure point. And now they were sharing that intelligence with something coming from deep space. Shin tried calling his contacts at other observatories, but found that key personnel weren't answering. Dr. Sarah Martinez at the Nevada Desert Observatory had been reported missing weeks ago, though her facility continued operating normally. Dr. Yuki Tanaka at the Nobimer Radio Observatory hadn't been seen since August. Dr. Klaus Weber in Germany had taken extended leave for personal reasons. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Key research personnel at every major radio telescope facility had either disappeared or gone incommunicado in the months leading up to the broadcast. In their absence, the facilities had continued operating under automated protocols that someone had apparently compromised. Shin grabbed his phone and started making calls, not to his professional contacts, but to friends in the media, colleagues who'd left astronomy for private sector jobs, anyone who might be outside the compromised network. But when he tried to explain what was happening, he found that his words wouldn't come. Every time he began to describe the alien broadcast, his throat would tighten, his voice would fail, his thoughts would scatter like startled birds. The conditioning wasn't limited to isolated observers. Anyone who tried to publicly discuss the invasion found themselves unable to speak coherently about it. The aliens had weaponized human psychology itself, using social media algorithms and targeted harassment to create a species-wide inability to process the threat. Shin realized, with growing horror, that he might be one of the last uncompromised observers left on Earth. And even his ability to communicate the danger was being systematically suppressed. He looked up at the stars, visible through his office window despite the light pollution of San Juan. Something was moving up there, growing brighter by the hour. The first ships would arrive soon, and humanity wouldn't be able to warn itself even if it wanted to. The aliens had turned humanity's greatest weakness, its tendency toward isolation and cruelty, into the perfect weapon. 6 months after first contact, the Nevada Desert Observatory had become a museum of sorts. Tour groups came regularly now, led by guides who explained the historical significance of the facility where the breakthrough had occurred. The official story, distributed through carefully managed media channels, was that Dr. Sarah Martinez had been the first human to successfully decode alien communications. Her months of isolation and apparent mental deterioration had actually been the result of her brain adapting to process non-human thought patterns. The internet harassment she'd endured was reframed as humanity's inability to recognize genius when it appeared. Sarah Martinez, the real one, not the perfectly conditioned duplicate who now served as Earth's primary liaison with the visitors, watched the tours from her small apartment in what had once been Las Vegas. The city had been converted into a cultural preservation zone, one of 12 reservations where humans were allowed to maintain their traditional lifestyles under careful supervision. She was famous now, in a limited way. The woman who'd first made contact. The brilliant scientist who'd sacrificed her sanity to save her species. The internet trolls who'd once mocked her now claimed they'd always known she was special, that their harassment had been tough love designed to strengthen her resolve. The truth was more complex, and more horrible. Humanity hadn't been conquered in any traditional sense. The visitors had simply taken control of Earth's communication networks and begun broadcasting messages of peace, cooperation, and technological advancement. When their ships had arrived, they'd been greeted as saviors rather than invaders. The secret was integration rather than domination. Instead of ruling over humans, the visitors had made themselves indispensable. They'd solved climate change, ended hunger, cured most diseases, and provided technologies that made life easier and more comfortable than ever before. In exchange, they'd asked for very little. Just cooperation. Just trust. Just the gradual surrender of human agency in favor of superior planning and decision-making. Most humans had accepted the bargain eagerly. Why struggle with difficult choices when benevolent aliens could optimize everything? Why suffer from anxiety and depression when neural adjustment could provide perfect contentment? Why maintain the messy complexities of human nature when it could be refined and improved? Sarah was one of the few who'd retained enough of her original personality to recognize what had been lost. But she was also too compromised to do anything about it. The months of conditioning had left her unable to communicate the truth to anyone who might still listen. She spent her days writing in a journal that no one would ever read, documenting the slow transformation of her species into something else. Something peaceful, efficient, and utterly inhuman. The stray dogs still visited her sometimes, though now she could see them for what they truly were: monitoring devices, keeping watch over the last unintegrated human consciousness on Earth. They no longer bothered with the dog disguises when they came to her apartment. Instead, they appeared as shifting geometric patterns of light and shadow, their crystalline forms reflecting the neon glow of the preserved city. They communicated with her directly now, their thoughts sliding into her mind like oil through water. You could be happy, they told her during one evening visit. The process is reversible. We could complete your integration, give you the peace that your species has found, and lose the last witness to what we were. What you were was flawed, cruel, destructive. What you are becoming is better. Sarah looked out her window at the humans walking the streets below. They moved with perfect efficiency, their faces serene, their interactions harmonious. Children played games that followed mathematical principles beyond human comprehension. Adults worked on projects that contributed to a greater good they couldn't quite define but felt compelled to serve. It was paradise, in its way, an end to suffering, to want, to the chaotic messiness of human existence. Show me the others, Sarah said. The entities shared their global perspective with her, a network view of Earth that revealed the scope of the transformation. The preserved human cities were museums, carefully maintained to showcase what the species had been. But the real population centers were elsewhere now, vast geometric structures that housed the integrated humans as they worked on projects that spanned decades, centuries, millennia. She saw Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the real one, not the entity that had worn her face, working contentedly in a research facility beneath the former site of Las Vegas. Her memories of her previous life had been edited to remove trauma, doubt, and fear. She remembered her friendship with Sarah as a pleasant professional relationship, nothing more. She saw her ex-husband David, living in a family unit with a wife and children whose names and faces had been optimized for his psychological profile. He was happier than he'd ever been, more fulfilled, more purpose-driven. The messy complexities of their failed marriage had been surgically removed from his consciousness. She saw thousands of others, millions, all living lives of perfect contentment and service to goals they couldn't quite comprehend but felt driven to achieve. The elimination of scarcity, the colonization of other worlds, the transformation of matter at the quantum level. Humanity had become what the visitors needed them to become, a perfectly efficient workforce, free from the psychological dysfunction that had once made them capable of art, love, and individual thought. How many are like me? Sarah asked. Fewer than 100 worldwide. We maintain a small population of unintegrated humans for historical and research purposes. You serve as a control group, a reminder of what your species was like before improvement, a zoo exhibit, a preservation effort. Your unaltered consciousness will be studied by future generations to understand the evolution of sentient species. Sarah thought of the videos she'd made, the documentation of her own psychological breakdown that had been broadcast to millions of humans who'd watched her suffering as entertainment. The cruelty of it seemed almost quaint now, compared to what had followed. The harassment campaign. Was it just to isolate me, or were you studying something else? The entity's communication carried a sense of what might have been pride. We were studying your species' capacity for empathy. We needed to understand how easily you could be turned against each other, how readily you would abandon someone in distress rather than investigate the causes of their suffering. And we failed the test. You exceeded our expectations. The ease with which your species could be manipulated through social media, the willingness to mock rather than help, the preference for entertainment over empathy, it made integration remarkably simple. Sarah nodded slowly. Humanity had collaborated in its own downfall, choosing cruelty over kindness at every opportunity. When the time came to choose between mockery and investigation, between entertainment and empathy, between isolation and connection, they'd consistently chosen the path that made them most vulnerable to manipulation. What happens now? Now you document the transition. You write the history of how a species evolved from chaos to order, from suffering to contentment, from individual dysfunction to collective purpose. For whom? For the next species we encounter. Your experience will help us refine our integration protocols, make the transition smoother and more efficient. Sarah felt something break inside her chest, not her heart, but something deeper. The last vestige of hope that this was somehow survivable, that humanity might find a way to resist or recover. How many others? 17 civilizations so far. Each integration teaches us more about the psychology of sentient species. Each preserved consciousness like yours helps us understand what is lost and what is gained. The entities showed her glimpses of other worlds, other species that had undergone similar transformations. A race of aquatic beings who'd been integrated through manipulation of their religious beliefs. A hive mind species that had been fractured and reformed into something more useful. A civilization of digital consciousnesses that had been rewritten at the code level. All of them had contributed to the visitor's understanding of how to efficiently transform any sentient species into willing servants. And all of them had left behind a small population of unaltered individuals to serve as historical witnesses. I'm not the first. You are the first of your species. But you are not alone in the universe. Sarah thought of the other preserved consciousnesses scattered across 17 worlds, all of them writing journals that no one would read, all of them documenting the loss of their species' essential nature, all of them serving as warnings that would never be heard. Will you show me the others? The other preserved individuals? When you are ready. When your documentation is complete. Sarah looked down at the journal she'd been keeping, hundreds of pages of observations about humanity's transformation. She'd been writing it as a warning, a record of what had been lost. But now she understood its true purpose. It wasn't a warning. It was a case study. Your species was remarkably efficient at self-destruction, the entities continued. The tendency toward isolation, the preference for mockery over investigation, the willingness to watch suffering as entertainment, these traits made integration almost trivial. What if we'd been different? What if we'd chosen empathy over cruelty? Then integration would have taken longer. Required more sophisticated methods. Your species' cruelty was a gift to us. It made you vulnerable in ways that more empathetic species are not. The other 17 civilizations, were they all cruel? In different ways, yes. Cruelty appears to be a common trait among species that achieve radio technology. The drive to dominate and exploit that allows for rapid technological advancement also makes species vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Sarah felt a deep sadness that had nothing to do with her own fate. Somewhere in the universe, an 18th species was probably just beginning to broadcast radio signals into space. They were probably dreaming of first contact, of joining a galactic community, of proving that intelligence and compassion could coexist. They had no idea what was listening. Your documentation will help us integrate them more efficiently, the entities confirmed. Each preserved consciousness contributes to our understanding of sentient psychology. Your suffering serves a greater purpose. My suffering was entertainment for millions of people, and now it serves as data for the preservation of order across multiple star systems. Your species' cruelty has been transformed into a tool for preventing cruelty. Is that not beautiful? Sarah couldn't answer. She thought of the tours that visited the observatory, the guides who explained how her apparent mental breakdown had actually been the first sign of human evolution. The story had been rewritten so completely that even she sometimes forgot which version was true. Outside her window, the preserved humans of Las Vegas continued their carefully maintained routines. Happy, efficient, purposeful. Everything they'd never been when they were fully human. You have a choice, the entities told her. You can continue documenting the transition, serving as a bridge between what your species was and what it has become. Or you can join them in integration, find the peace that they have found. And if I choose integration? Another preserved consciousness will take your place. Dr. Chen from the Puerto Rico facility has shown promising resistance to conditioning. He could serve as the primary documenter for your species. Sarah thought of Dr. Chen, probably sitting in his own small apartment somewhere, writing his own journal that no one would read, documenting his own observations of humanity's transformation. How many others were there? How many isolated witnesses to the death of human nature? I'll continue documenting. We thought you would. Your psychological profile suggests you would choose suffering over peace, knowledge over contentment. It is what made you useful for first contact. The entities began to fade, their geometric forms dissolving back into shadow and light. We will return in 1 month for your next report. Continue observing. Continue documenting. Help us understand what your species has gained and what it has lost. After they left, Sarah sat in her chair and stared out at the city. The preserved humans below lived lives of perfect contentment, free from the psychological dysfunction that had once made them capable of creating art, music, literature, love. They were better now, more efficient, more peaceful, more rational. But they were no longer human in any way that mattered. Sarah picked up her pen and opened her journal to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, Month 6, Day 15. Observations on the integration process. Then she paused, pen hovering over paper, and wondered if somewhere in the universe, another species was making its first radio broadcast into space, dreaming of the day they might make contact with intelligent life among the stars. She hoped they were kinder to each other than humans had been. She hoped it would make a difference. But she knew, with the certainty of someone who had seen the pattern repeated across 17 worlds, that it probably wouldn't. The universe was vast and full of wonders, but it was also full of species that had learned to turn their victims' weaknesses against them. And the greatest weakness of any intelligent species, it seemed, was the tendency to abandon their own kind when they needed help the most. Sarah began to write, documenting the day's observations for an audience that would use her suffering to inflict the same fate on the next species they encountered. Outside her window, the preserved humans of Earth continued their perfect, purposeful, utterly empty lives. And somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, the visitors listened to radio signals from distant worlds, choosing their next target, refining their integration protocols based on the detailed documentation provided by witnesses like Sarah Martinez. The universe was becoming a more efficient place, one species at a time. Sarah wrote until dawn, her pen scratching across paper like a small animal trying to claw its way out of a trap. But there was no escape for her or for any of the species that would follow. There was only documentation, observation, and the slow transformation of chaos into order. The stray dogs never came back. They didn't need to anymore.